And unless we overcome this major crisis, the growth itself will get stagnated after some time. It's already happening. Inequality. People don't realize that growth and more equitable distribution go hand in hand. Now the Chinese are building up projects in the CPEC area, but they might remain underutilized because unless they have the big market that India offers, many of the projects may not find fruition. So allying with India, working together gives a much better prospect for Asia. That would be, the one you anticipate. But I'm afraid that there could be stagnation at one level, but they will overcome it, and they will overcome it over a longer period than 2050. That's my submission.
Thank you very much, Chair. Rajiv Bhatia, former ambassador. Let me just make two brief comments and then ask a question to the author. My research shows that it was very fashionable and popular to talk about Asian century in the last decade of the previous century and the first decade of this century. It does require some extraordinary courage to talk about Asian century in the second decade and to say that you are optimistic at a time when actually the level of pessimism has been increasing. This partly also depends on one's definition of Asia. We all know that it begins from Japan, but does it end in Bangkok, or does it also include Central Asia and West Asia? If it does, then besides geopolitics, I think radicalization and terrorism and all the related issues have to be referred to and measured in order to assess whether we are heading towards Asian century. My question is, Chair said that we chose this time because of Mr. Trump, but I think 19th Congress has really put a spoke in the wheel of this thesis. The word from Beijing is China dream or Chinese dream. China is dreaming of Chinese century, which runs really counter to Asian century, which is a much more inclusive concept. And therefore, while your conclusion is very smart, that is, if growth is sustainable, etc., and if the governments do this, that, and the other, it will happen. Otherwise, it will not happen. The fact is that today, to my mind, a more realistic, pessimistic, cynical view would be much more justified. Do you agree? Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlemen there.
My name is Madhu Thakkar. I'm a classmate of Rajat from IIT. Professor Mukherjee mentioned something about the China and India, and Ambassador also mentioned this. We want to tango with China, but then why are we afraid of the One Belt, One Road project and have stayed away from that? Are we also not allowing United States to dictate our relationship with China?
Thank you. Yes.
I know the discussion is getting slightly off track from Asian century to the problem with the dragon. Now I have a question, for Mr. Shamshar. What have we learned from Doklam? China, of course, would like to bully, but what lessons has it learned from its incursions in Vietnam and its experimentation in Doklam? So when it finds that it's not going to be a one-way street, and is deterrence going to bring some sense into the Chinese mind? And second, we have been talking about this contradiction between not having glasnost and perestroika together. Is this Chinese equilibrium sustainable in the sense that if the President Xi Jinping is trying to become another Mao, is it possible to become another Mao in the 2020s.
Thank you, Ashok. Yes, the lady there, please.
It's the big white button.
Hi, I'm Dia with the Asia Foundation. My question actually is to Dr. Baru about, I think you mentioned sort of economic growth and gender inclusion as being sort of mutually exclusive or not necessary. You know, there was recently a report from the World Economic Forum with the whole India being ranked very low on the gender gap index. And I know that women's economic participation specifically was one of the lower numbers. And you know, India, I think only like less than 30%, I think 27% of Indian women are in the labor force, and that's declining. You know, there are a number of factors behind that. But I wanted to ask you, you know, if we're looking at the Asian century and looking at India more specifically, because I know more about that than China, but how do you think that India will be able to move forward if women are not encouraged to participate in economic activities and pursue economic opportunities?
Okay, I think we've got a pretty nice selection. Should we take one more and then we'll kind of close it and then we'll see if there's another more energy in the room. Yes.
Anupam Khanna. Yeah, I'll step back. What makes a century a particular, gives it a character? We had Pax Romana, ancient times, Pax Britannica, and Pax Americana. And in some ways it subsumes some of the things that, for example, Shah said. Pax Americana was not really about the Americas, it was Pax United States. So in that sense, when we talk about Pax Asiana, it's likely we are talking about Pax Sinica. I mean, that's the point, and nobody denies that that will be a necessary part. However, we are focusing too much on the economic side. So my question to Rajat is, if you think about these three sort of epochs, it was not just economic might that determined it, it was very much there. There was always, at least in those three cases, a hegemonic role. Hegemon in the negative sense, somebody could enforce their will over the... Number two, who guaranteed the provision of certain essential public goods for that to exist. For example, in the case of Britain, go back, it was the sea lanes, etc. That's what the Americans also did, or security. Third, there was another dimension to all of them, and especially in the case of Pax Americana, which was the idea of America, the iconic, everybody, the reason last century was Americana was not just because it was a hyperpower, but because everybody wanted to emulate the Americans. It was something that captured the imagination. When you bring those other dimensions in, I think we are overly playing the economic side. How do you think Asia, I mean, I don't see any of the other side of Asia really pulling together, so how can it be an Asian century? Even this, it cannot even be a Sinica, because I don't see that, those other dimensions coming together yet.
Okay, I'm going to take one last question, then we'll throw it back to the panel. Yes.
Thank you, Shikil. I am Rajesh Chadha from National Council of Applied Economic Research and had the privilege of attending almost all the lectures that Rajat you had given. And I just have a very brief intervention that you did mention somewhere in your talk that trade is an important variable, or trade is an important function that Asia needs to be. So once we have the RCEP, TPP breaking down, and TPP in particular, so China, when we talk about China's prowess, it is trade which is underlying in a big way. So how do you see the trade integration or an Asian integration doing good for the growth, apart from clean, green, and inclusive?
So, Rajat, do you want to go first, and then I'll reverse the order and have Sanjay and Shyam go thereafter?
Thanks very much. Thanks both to Shyam and to Sanjay for excellent comments, and also these comments from the floor. Let me take a step back a bit about the Asian century. It's a telegraphic message. I mean, sort of obviously it's going to have pockets of growth and pockets of falling behind, pockets of poverty, pockets of prosperity. But it is, I think, a fact that over the last 50 years, the center of gravity of the world economic influence shifting eastwards. What used to be the center of gravity of the world economics is sort of now, the latest I saw was somewhere in Central Asia and steadily moving eastwards. By 2050, it is probably going to be somewhere, in Beijing. So the Asian century is basically a reflection and a questioning, actually. I mean, it's not that I'm saying there will be Asian century. I'm questioning whether this extrapolation is actually realistic, and my answer is no. But I'm also saying that there are circumstances and preconditions which make it plausible, even though it's not inevitable. Having said that, China obviously is a major force. China was, even when we started these lectures, and now even more so with the Chinese Dream, the 19th Congress and all of that. But what I feel, and I did mention briefly in my lecture, that two countries, the two most populous, and India will be more populous than China, and two countries economically, China will be number one, is already number one in terms of PPPs, India is number 3, but will get to be number 2 by 2040. India is going to be, both for its market, both for its resources, human resources, technological resources, a force to reckon with. So no matter what China wants to do, India cannot be ignored. I think it is up to India also to play that role in a more proactive way rather than a defensive way. And this goes back to a question that, Madhu, you raised about BRI. I personally think India should not react negatively to BRI just because it's a Chinese proposition. India should react negatively to BRI because I think it is actually a half-baked concept and should argue it on that basis rather than. But China cannot grow on its own. It needs markets. And some estimates that my colleague, Dr. Kawai from the University of Tokyo and I have done show that by 2050, Chinese GDP, of course, will be large, but it will not be equal to that. It will be less than Europe and US and the rest of Asia combined. So it's not as if China sort of will be predominant in the world economic scene and sort of do what it wants to do. Same thing will happen in global governance. I think Chinese dreams will have more chances of being fulfilled. And if there's one thing Chinese are, they're very pragmatic. They'll recognize that there is greater benefit to them. There'll be minor irritations and maybe not so minor irritations in greater cooperation in the region, including with India. Now, only time will tell, but I don't think Chinese leadership will risk losing it all by really taking on what I consider would be very unproductive excursions or incursions. And yes, therefore, there will be this intrusions in South China Sea, there'll be intrusions on borders here and there, but better sense will prevail for self-interest, and therefore I think Deng Xiaoping will be proven more right in terms of the Asian century or a Chinese century will only come if it is also an Indian and Chinese century. That's my, not just hope, I mean, that's my conviction, and based on history where countries have actually, whether it was the Roman Empire or whether it was the British, and some would say even the Americans, when they overstretched, when the economic power didn't quite match the military power and their sort of adventurism got the better of them. So I feel that the Chinese obviously will be a major force, but it will be a multipolar Asia, it will be a multipolar world where China, India, Japan, and again I keep bringing Japan because I think we write off Japan too readily. Japan is still a very important economy. It will be still be in 2050, even with declining population, number 8 actually, in the top 10. Korea, Australia, so there will be, I think you were alluding to it, Shekhar, the diamond quadrangle of India, Japan, Korea, and Australia. There will be security, shall we say, not exercise, the security buffers against China created by the democracies in this region, aided by the US. And I see India, Japan, Korea, Australia being that bulwark, as it were. But I think that if nothing else, self-interest from China's point of view will ultimately determine the outcome of the century, in which India will play a part. But India must also, and Shyam would be the best person to talk about this, India also needs to act as a grown-up. India doesn't have to react and react defensively. India is economic power and should act in that way. You talking about the middle income trap, I think is a very good point, and that's exactly the challenge, that countries get caught in the middle income trap because they can't compete with countries above them, they can't design the iPad, and their wage costs have gone up, and they therefore cannot assemble the shoes anymore, and therefore they're neither here nor there, they get caught. But having said that, I think India is far from getting into that middle income trap zone. It's usually about $10,000, $14,000 per capita. So India, I think, need not worry too much whether it'll get caught in the middle income trap. I would rather India gets to that level and then worries about it. But it is true that investments in health and education are absolutely critical to keep moving our productivity, to moving us up the productivity ladder. Rajiv, as always, you have a way of asking the most difficult and awkward questions. The Chinese century runs counter to the Asian century, and you asked me if I agree, and obviously I don't. I think the Chinese century will play a more dominant role in the Asian century, and for rightly so, they're the largest economy. But I don't think Chinese century will happen without the Asian century happening as well. It's not a binary, it's not a either or. And the Asia that we're defining, Rajiv, is basically the entire sort of, West Central Asia, South Asia, East Asia. So it's a much larger mass in which the multipolarity will rule. Dia raised a question about the female labor force participation. I will leave Sanjay to answer that. But I will say that and you know my views on this, that good governance, gender equality, gender equity, gender sort of, deprivations or lack of it, may not be sufficient for economic growth, but they're necessary conditions. And without those being recognized, I don't think any society can sort of prosper, or at least prosper sustainably. Maybe I should stop there and have other colleagues coming. Sorry?
Very quickly, I didn't want to speak about my own work when commenting on Rajat, but Anupam's question provokes me to maybe in 3 or 4 sentences I've written on this, which is that the 19th century was regarded as Britain's century or Western Europe's century because Western Europe was both the geo-economic and the geopolitical power, dominant geo-economic and geopolitical power. And so was the case for the United States in the 20th century. It became the dominant geo-economic and the geopolitical power. And that is where the 21st century is going to be different. Because there is, as Rajat correctly says, greater dispersal of geo-economic power. The rise of China is the most important phenomenon, but there are other centers of economic activity. There's a lot of surplus capital available, for example, in the Middle East today, which is going to be increasingly productively invested in development of science, technology, education, etc. The plans that the Arabs have to make use of fascinating plans are being drawn up. The geo-economic power of the 21st century is going to be more dispersed. So will the geopolitical power be. The fact is today United States spends more on defense than the next 9 nations put together. Of the top 10, Russia, China included, the next 9 nations spend less than the US alone. So US remains a dominant military power. But geopolitical power is not just military power, it's more than that. And therefore, the 21st century is a century in which, for both on the grounds of geo-economic power and geopolitical power, you have a greater dispersal.
So in that sense, it's fundamentally different from the last 2 centuries. And therefore the question you pose is important. But very quickly to reply, see, World Bank, World Economic Forum, everybody likes to now say the correct things, right? Gender equality is good, lack of transparency is good, democracy is good. I have no problem with that. I mean, these are all, in terms of values and aspirational agenda, they are all very good. I am asking a very simple question. Has it made a difference to economic growth and the economic power of nations? Europe was not a gender equal society through the 19th century. The United States has lower female participation in work than even many Asian countries. So merely because these are now socially, politically desirable goals, and I'm not questioning that at all. I'm saying where is the statistical evidence to show correlation